Late at night. A dark bedroom. Claire, 7 months pregnant, sits motionless on the edge of the bed, her husband's phone in her hand, her face completely empty of expression. Nothing left but stone. Derek steps out of the bathroom. He sees her. He freezes. Claire, voice low enough to chill the air, not a single tremor. How long? Not a question. Command. Derek. Head dropping. Each word breaking on the way out. 8 months. 8 months. The child inside her, 7 months. That overlap settles between them like something just detonated. Claire rises, walks past him, never once making contact, sleeps somewhere else. Tonight, and probably every night after that. But that was not the cruelest thing he did. 3 weeks later, at a prenatal appointment, the doctor turns the screen around and the name on it is not hers. Claire, one slow breath. Head lifts. Voice frighteningly calm. He had a plan. Then so will I. The man thought he was leaving behind a woman with nothing. What he did not know, he had just created a queen. Claire's entire journey is waiting for you right below. Follow now, so you don't miss the moment he drives past and sees exactly what she built without him. The phone was charging on his side of the nightstand. That was the first thing. Derek always kept it face down. Claire had been noticing that for months. She had told herself it was a privacy thing. He was in sales. His phone was always going off. He needed the sleep. She had told herself a lot of things. It was 11:47 at night. The bedroom was dark except for the small orange glow of the charging cable. Derek was in the shower. Claire was 7 weeks pregnant and could not sleep because the baby was pressing both feet into her lower ribs with the cheerful enthusiasm of someone who had never once considered her personal comfort. She sat up slowly. She reached for her own phone on her side of the nightstand, intending to read something mindless until the baby settled. And then Derek's screen lit up. One notification. 4 words. Savannah, I keep thinking about last night. I cannot stop. Claire looked at it for a long time. The shower was still running. She could hear the water hitting the tile, steady and ordinary, like background noise from another life. She picked up his phone. It was not locked. It had never been locked because that would have been suspicious, and Derek Ashworth was very careful about the appearance of having nothing to hide. She opened the thread. She read. She read back 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months. She read the way you read, when you already know the ending, but cannot stop yourself from reading toward it anyway. The baby kicked hard once, like he understood what was happening on the other side of whatever wall separated them. Like he was saying, Mom, Mom, please, put the phone down. She did not put it down. She read back 6 months. By the time Derek came out of the bathroom in his towel, rubbing the back of his hair with a smaller towel, Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone in her hand and her face completely still. That stillness scared him more than screaming would have. He knew his wife. He had known her for 8 years. He knew what the stillness meant. She did not yell. She said very quietly, how long? Not a question, a demand. Derek looked at the phone in her hand. He looked at her face. She watched him go through what looked like 3 seconds of calculating whether to deny it. She watched his face do the math. She watched him decide the math did not work. Claire, just let me, how long? He sat down on the chair across the room, the one they had found at a flea market on their honeymoon in Savannah, Georgia, of all places, which now felt like a detail the universe had planted deliberately. They had spent a warm Saturday afternoon refinishing that chair together in the parking lot of their apartment building, laughing about what the neighbors must think. He sat in that chair now and put his head in his hands. 8 months, he said. 8 months. Their baby was 7 months old inside her body. The timing sat between them like something detonated. You started this.
She could not finish the sentence.
Her throat closed around the end of it. Before we knew about the baby, he said. Fast. Like it was a defense. That does not. She stopped again. She put her hand on her stomach. Both hands, actually. The way she had started doing automatically in the last few weeks without noticing. The baby was very still. She looked at Derek. She really looked at him. The way you look at something when you are trying to decide whether the image in front of you matches the image you have been carrying for years. At the man she had given up her career for. At the man whose shirts she ironed every Sunday morning. At the man whose mother she had defended, whose friends she had cooked for, whose dreams she had treated like they were also her dreams, because somewhere along the way she had forgotten to keep track of her own. She looked at him and she felt something shift inside her. Not break, shift, like tectonic plates, like the ground was rearranging itself underneath everything she thought was solid. She stood up. She walked past him. She did not touch him. She went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she had always gone when she did not know what to do with herself. She stood at the counter and she looked at the fruit bowl they had picked out together at a farmer's market 3 years ago. She looked at the calendar on the refrigerator, the one with the watercolor flowers on it that Margaret had sent, with the baby's due date circled in red marker. and a small star drawn beside it. She looked at the coffee maker, the dish rack, the window above the sink with the dark glass reflecting her own face back at her, pale and unfamiliar. The shower was still running warm steam into the hallway. She took out her own phone. She called Danny. 3 rings. 4. The faint sound of Danny fumbling with her phone in the dark. Then Danny's voice, low and surprised and a little alarmed. "Claire, it is almost midnight. What? He has been cheating on me for 8 months." Her own voice came out flat and factual, like she was reporting the weather to someone who needed to know before going outside. "I am 7 months pregnant, and he has been cheating on me for 8 months." Silence on the line. A very specific kind of silence. Then Danny's voice, careful. Too careful. The voice of someone choosing every word. "Claire, honey," and that was when Claire knew. That voice. That particular careful voice that Danny only used when she was about to say something she had been rehearsing. Something she had been deciding whether to say. Danny. Her own voice dropped to almost nothing. "Did you know?" The silence stretched. It was 3 seconds. Maybe 4. But it was the loudest 4 seconds Claire had ever heard. Mirror moment Claire standing at the kitchen counter at 11:47 at night. One hand on her phone. One hand on her stomach. Looking at the calendar on the refrigerator with the due date circled in red and the little star beside it. The refrigerator hums. The fruit bowl sits there in the dark like nothing has happened. The shower runs. And every woman who has ever stood in her kitchen at a terrible hour, doing terrible arithmetic in her head, adding up what she now knows against all the things she thought she knew before, will feel this in her bones. Derek appeared in the kitchen doorway. He said her name. She did not turn around. She was looking at her own face in the dark glass of the kitchen window. She looked like a stranger. She looked like a woman she had not met yet. "I need you to sleep somewhere else tonight," she said. "Claire, please, just let me." "Tonight," she said. And probably every night after that, she still did not turn around. She listened to the sound of him standing there. She listened to him not knowing what to do with his hands. She listened to him make a sound that was almost a word and then stop himself. Then she listened to him leave. She stood at the counter until the refrigerator hummed, and the calendar hung on its hook, and the baby shifted inside her. Slow and deliberate, like he was getting comfortable, like he was settling in for whatever came next. She allowed herself one thought only, before she shut everything down and went to find a blanket for the couch. I knew and I let myself not know. She opened her phone. She typed DIBORCE into the search bar. Then she deleted it and typed it again, the same way. Wrong. She almost laughed, almost. Danny came over at 7 the next morning. She brought decaf coffee in the taller cups from the place on 5th, and a white box of croissants, and the particular expression of someone who has been awake all night rehearsing a speech, and is not sure it is a good enough speech. Claire let her in. She did not hug her. Danny noticed. She noticed the way you notice when the person you have known for 20 years does not do the thing they always do. They sat at the kitchen table. The morning light came through the window above the sink and hit the fruit bowl and the calendar and all the ordinary objects that had been sitting there while the world came apart the night before. Danny wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the table. She looked at the fruit bowl. She looked everywhere that was not Claire's face. "How long have you known?" Claire said. "I did not know." Danny's breath came out unevenly. "I had a feeling," she said. "I saw them at the Henderson conference. They were standing near the coffee station, and they were talking, and it was not—" She stopped. It was not how coworkers talk. The way they were standing. The way he looked at her when she said something. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself I had probably had one too many glasses of wine at the opening dinner. "October," Claire said. The math arrived automatically. "That was 4 months ago." "I know. I was pregnant in October. I was already pregnant." "I know, Claire." Danny's voice cracked down the middle. "I am so sorry. I kept telling myself I was not sure enough. I kept saying to myself that if I was wrong, I would be the person who put that idea in your head and wrecked your marriage over a feeling at a conference. And I did not want to be that person." "You did not want to hurt me," Claire said. "Yes. So instead you let me spend 4 more months being lied to." There was no good answer to that. Some choices, when you actually say them out loud in the morning light, do not have a defense. They just sit between two people, honest and ugly and very still. Claire looked at her best friend, the woman who had known her since they were both 19 years old and sharing a dorm room that smelled like instant noodles. The woman who had been her maid of honor, who 3 weeks ago had stood in this same kitchen hanging paper lanterns for a baby shower, with a cake that said "Little One Coming Soon" in pale yellow frosting. "I need to know right now," Claire said, "whether you are going to be in my corner. Because I cannot do this with someone who is going to be diplomatic. Diplomatic is not available to me right now. If you are in, you are all the way in. If you are not, I need you to go." Danny looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges. "I am in," she said. "I swear to God I am completely in." Claire nodded. She picked up a croissant. "Put it down." picked it up again. She had not eaten since yesterday afternoon, and the baby did not care about the circumstances. The baby needed something. Then I need you to tell me everything you saw. The recognition pain arrived in full force in the hours that followed. Derek came back that morning. He had not gone to a hotel. He had slept in his car in the driveway, which Claire discovered by looking out the bedroom window at 6:30 and seeing the car still there. She found this neither touching nor pitiful. She found it informative. He had not gone to Savannah. He had sat in the driveway all night. That told her something. She was not yet sure what. He wanted to talk. He used the word complicated. He said it was not emotional, and then immediately contradicted himself when she did not respond. He said she knew it was not going anywhere. He said, you and I had been so distant lately. He said, I have been feeling disconnected from you for a long time now. Claire sat across from him at the kitchen table, where she had just been sitting with Danny. She listened to all of it with the same still face she had been wearing since the night before. Then she said, I was growing your child, I know. I was tired and uncomfortable and scared, and I was growing your child inside my body. And you felt disconnected. Claire, I want you out of the house by Friday. He started to protest. He said, this does not have to be permanent. He said, we should talk to someone before we make any decisions. He said, just think about the baby. He said the word baby 3 times in 30 seconds as though their son were an argument for her to stay, rather than the precise reason her anger had no ceiling and no floor. The baby, she said quietly, is exactly why you should go. Because I will not have my child born into a house that is poisoned. He went. Breathing room, she runs a bath after he leaves. She does not get in. She sits on the edge of the tub in her robe, and she listens to the water filling up, the sound of it, the warmth of the steam rising around her. She does not think about what comes next. She does not make plans or lists or decisions. For 12 full minutes, she just sits with the steam and breathes. The baby does a slow, gentle roll, less urgent than usual. She closes her eyes. She lets the world be exactly as terrible as it is without trying to fix anything yet. Then the water gets too high and she leans over and turns off the tap. And she gets up. And she gets dressed. And she goes back out into it. She called her mother. Margaret picked up on the first ring, because mothers always pick up. Margaret listened to everything. The whole story, in order, from the notification on the nightstand to Danny's careful silence to the conversation at the kitchen table. She listened without interrupting, which was not entirely usual for her. When Claire finished, there was a brief silence. Then Margaret said, I will be on a plane tomorrow morning. Mama, you really do not have to. I was not asking, baby. I am telling you what is going to happen. The major early twist arrived around what should have been an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Claire had a prenatal appointment. She sat in the waiting room of her OB's office with a magazine she did not read, a magazine whose pages she turned without seeing. Her OB, a calm and thorough woman named Dr. Payne, who had a gift for making difficult conversations feel manageable, asked the standard questions. How are you sleeping? Any unusual swelling? Any changes in fetal movement?
How are your stress levels?
Claire laughed. It came out shorter than she intended. She said that things at home had been difficult. She gave the broad version without details, because she was not ready to give details to everyone yet. Dr. Payne nodded. She checked something on her computer screen. She paused, in a particular way that made Claire look up. Has anything changed with your insurance situation, doctor? Payne asked. I ask because our billing department received a notification about a change to your coverage policy. Claire went very still. What kind of change? She said. Dr. Payne turned the computer screen slightly so Claire could see it. Derek had removed Claire from his employer-sponsored health insurance 3 weeks ago. He had added a new beneficiary to the policy. The name was Savannah Price. Validation whisper, I am not crazy. I know exactly what I saw. I know exactly what I heard. And I know what I felt for months before I could name any of it, that low hum of wrongness that I kept explaining away. He was not distant. He was already gone. He had already made different arrangements. He had already decided where this was going, and he just did not mention it to me. Claire sat on the paper-covered examination table with her enormous belly and her medical gown, and she stared at the wall behind the computer screen. She stared at it for a long moment. The baby kicked, sharp and purposeful. She put both hands on her stomach. She said out loud, in the quiet examination room, to no one and to herself and to whatever version of Derek she was still carrying around in her head, okay, he had a plan. I was not in it. Okay, then I will have a plan too. On the drive home, she called the office of Thomas Breck, attorney at law. She had found the name on her phone the night before, after the search that she kept mistyping. She got his voicemail. She left a message in a voice that was steadier than she expected. She said her name. She said she needed to schedule a consultation. She said clearly and without any hedging, my husband has been having an affair for 8 months. I am 7 months pregnant. I have just learned he removed me from his health insurance and added another woman's name as beneficiary. I would very much like to discuss what my options are. She hung up. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was not what she would have chosen. And she was 7 months pregnant and sitting in a parking lot outside her doctor's office. Okay, she said to her reflection. Let us go. Margaret Osei arrived the next morning with 2 large suitcases, a slow cooker in its original box, a tin of cookies she had baked on the flight layover, which was not possible but which Margaret had apparently managed anyway, and an energy that Claire recognized immediately as battle mode. Margaret in battle mode wore her reading glasses on top of her head. She moved through spaces with the efficient certainty of someone who had managed 400 middle schoolers for 30 years and had never once had to raise her voice to do it. She simply moved with authority and the world reorganized itself accordingly. She came through the door. She looked at the apartment. She looked at the fruit bowl and the calendar and the door to the guest room that was currently Derek's coat collection and would soon be a nursery. She put down her bags. She hugged Claire for a long time, both arms, her chin resting on Claire's shoulder, saying nothing, just holding. Then she released her, patted her once on the cheek, and went to the kitchen. She started making soup. Claire sat at the table and watched her mother move through this kitchen that had been hers for 6 years, opening cabinets with the confidence of someone who had cooked in enough kitchens to know where things were kept. For the first time since 11:47 on Tuesday night, she felt something that was recognizably close to safe. Thomas Breck called back, Claire said. Good, her mother said without turning around. He has an opening Friday afternoon. Good. Derek is coming to collect more of his things on Thursday. Her mother's back was to her. She was chopping celery with calm, unhurried strokes. Would you like me to be here for that? Margaret asked. I think Claire considered it carefully. I think I need to handle that one myself. Her mother turned around. She held the knife loosely at her side, and she looked at her daughter with the look that Claire had grown up with, the one that distinguished between the moment to step in and the moment to step back, and was usually right about which was which. You are sure? She asked. No, Claire said honestly, but I think I need to be. That night, after Margaret went to sleep, Claire could not. She went to the room that was supposed to be the nursery. They had painted it together, she and Derek, on a Saturday in September that she had thought of as one of the good days. They had gone back and forth on the color for weeks. She had wanted something warm, and he had agreed. They had painted in old clothes, and she had gotten yellow on her nose, and he had laughed at her, and she had painted his elbow in retaliation. And then they had eaten pizza on the floor and talked about names. She sat in the rocking chair they had assembled from a flat box on a Sunday afternoon, and she started going through her memories the way you go through old photographs in a box, holding each one up, examining it, asking whether the image in the photo matches the image in your memory. The Venice anniversary trip. He planned the whole thing himself. I thought that meant something. I still think it means something, that he was capable of planning it, that part of him was still there trying. But he kept checking his phone by the canal, and I thought it was work email because it was always work email. Was it her? Was I standing in Venice with a man who was somewhere else entirely? The night I told him about the baby, he cried. Real tears, real surprise. That felt real. That felt like him, the him I married. The timing means the affair was already 2 months old. How do you cry real tears about a baby when you are already 2 months into hiding something like that? Does the crying still mean something? I think it does. I think it just means that he is a man who can feel two completely contradictory things at the same time and not find that strange. Stop. Think about something else. But there is nothing else right now. This is the only room in her mind, and she keeps walking into it. She got up from the rocking chair. She reorganized the nursery. She had almost nothing to reorganize. The furniture was assembled. The books were in a box. The onesies were in the drawer of the small dresser they had painted white. So she did what she could. She refolded all 17 onesies with exceptional precision. She arranged the books alphabetically on the low shelf. She wiped the changing table surface twice, then a third time. She checked the window latch. She moved the lamp 2 inches to the left and then back again. She found this calming in a way that made no rational sense. But the hands needed something to do, and the hands worked on whatever was available. Mirror moment, refolding tiny onesies at 2 in the morning because it is the only thing she can control. Any woman who has ever cleaned something obsessively at a terrible hour, who has reorganized a drawer or scrubbed a counter or rearranged a shelf during a crisis because the hands need something to do while the mind does its harder work, recognizes this completely. You are not cleaning. You are surviving until morning. The baby was quiet tonight. He seemed to know she needed quiet. She went back to bed at 2:45. She did not sleep. Derek came Thursday as scheduled. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week. His clothes were not quite right, like he had packed quickly and grabbed the wrong things. He had the slightly unmoored look of a person who no longer knows where his home is. He moved through the apartment with careful neutrality. The watch collection from the top of the bedroom dresser. The golf shoes from the hall closet. The specific coffee maker he had brought from his previous apartment before they moved in together and had always referred to as his. Claire stood in the living room and watched him. Not helping, not hindering, just there. He paused at the bookshelf. There were photographs there. The bookshelf had always held photographs. Their wedding, in the silver frame that Margaret had given them. A trip to Colorado 2 years ago where they had hiked farther than intended and ended up sitting on a rock eating granola bars and laughing about it. A photograph from his mother's last birthday dinner, the six of them around a table at Ruth's favorite restaurant. He picked up the wedding photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that Claire watched his face move through several things she could not quite name. Then he looked at her. "I did not want it to be like this," he said. She studied his face. And she knew in the way she had always things about him that he meant it. That was the specific, particular cruelty of people who did what he did. They genuinely did not want the consequences. They wanted the marriage and the secret and the clean conscience. They wanted everything without the weight of any of it. And when the weight arrived anyway, they were sincerely, authentically sorry about it, which was not nothing. But it was also not enough. "What did you want it to be like?" she asked. He did not have an answer. He stood there holding the photograph and he did not have an answer. "Put the photo down, Derek." He put it down. "I am sorry," he said, "for what it is worth." "It is worth something," she said, because she had decided some point in the last 3 days that she was going to be honest even when honesty was not simple. "But it is not worth enough." He picked up the last of his boxes. He left. She stood in the living room alone. She looked at the space on the bookshelf where the wedding photograph sat, where Derek had put it back down. He had picked it up and put it back and taken everything else and left. She put her hand on her belly. She thought about the career she had paused because his schedule was demanding, the apartment they had chosen because it was close to his office, not hers, the friends she had started seeing less often because fitting them in around his social calendar was logistically complicated, the opinions she had softened over the years, not all at once but gradually, the way you turn down a volume dial one notch at a time until you cannot remember what the original volume sounded like. Validation whisper. Somewhere along the way I became invisible, not all at once, gradually, like a slow tide going out, and I helped it happen. I made choices that contributed to it. That is something I need to sit with honestly, and then I need to stop. I need to stop making myself smaller. I need to stop making room at my own expense. That is not a kindness to anyone. It turned out it was not even a kindness to him. Breathing room, she runs the bath again, but this time she gets in. The water is very warm. The bathroom fills with steam, and it is small and quiet and entirely hers. She stays in until the water cools around her. She does not think about strategy. She does not make plans or lists. She does not review anything. She just floats in the cooling water and breathes and lets 20 minutes belong to nothing. Then she gets out. She dries off slowly. She checks on the nursery one more time before bed. The onesies are still in their correct drawers. She puts her palm flat on the yellow painted wall for a moment and stands there. She does not say anything. She does not have to. The hook, at 4 in the morning, she cannot sleep. She opens her laptop and searches her own name. Something she has not done in years. She finds her old portfolio, the work she did before she stepped aside. She clicks through every piece. She was very good at this. She had almost entirely forgotten. She looks at the screen for a long time. Blue light in the dark room, the baby shifting quietly inside her. And she thinks, I used to know exactly who I was. She closes the laptop. I will find her again, she thinks. She is somewhere around here. She cannot have gone very far. Thomas Breck's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with clean lines and a lot of natural light and a lobby that smelled like good coffee and carpet that had been recently vacuumed. He met her in the lobby himself. She had not expected that. He was tall, with the careful posture of someone who paid attention to things, and he shook her hand with a firm and professional grip and said, Mrs. Ashworth, thank you for coming in. Can I get you some water before we go up? Something about the simple normalcy of that question, someone asking her a thoughtful question, someone being attentive in a way that required nothing from her in return, made her eyes sting unexpectedly. She blinked it away. I am fine, thank you, she said. She sat across from him in his office, with the winter light coming through the tall windows and her folder of organized documents on the desk between them. She told him everything. The phone, the 8 months, the insurance change. She had organized everything in labeled sections, because she was always organized. Because organization was one of the things about herself she had never let anyone take from her, and she laid the documents out one by one like she was presenting a case, which was, she supposed, exactly what she was doing. Thomas asked good questions. He was precise without being cold. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a pen he kept clicking absently. When she finished, he set the pen down. He said, "I want you to understand something before we talk about strategy." She waited. "What he did to your insurance while you are 7 months pregnant with his child is not simply an affair complication," he said. "It is potentially actionable in ways that go significantly beyond standard divorce proceedings. Are you prepared to pursue this aggressively?" She looked at him. She thought about the yellow nursery walls, about 17 onesies in their correct drawers, about Derek picking up the wedding photograph and putting it back down and walking out the door. "Yes," she said. The anger arrived. Layer 4. Righteous and clean and absolutely necessary. Thomas explained what they could do. He was methodical and thorough and did not soften anything. She appreciated this more than she had words for. She had had enough of things being softened. She had softened enough things herself to last a lifetime. The finances were the first revelation. Derek's salary, which Claire knew, was one number. Derek's investments, which she had trusted him to manage because of the offhand arrangement they had drifted into, were another number entirely. A significantly larger number, a number that had been moved, quietly and over time, across the past 8 months, into accounts that existed outside of anything she had access to. Thomas slid the document across the desk. Claire looked at the number. She said very calmly, "He was planning to leave." "It appears that way," Thomas said. "He was planning to leave before the baby came. That is what the timeline suggests." She looked at the number again. She looked at the dates. She looked at the 8 months of withdrawals running perfectly parallel to the 8 months of the affair, two tracks laid down simultaneously, carefully, with intention. "He took our marriage and he took our finances," she said, "and he was going to leave me pregnant and uninsured." And Mrs. Ashworth, Thomas's voice was level and steady, a hand on the wheel. "Let us talk about what that means for your case." She took a breath. She said, "Let us validation whisper." He had a plan. He had a whole careful plan. He moved money and changed insurance and arranged his exit like he was managing a project, and I was the project he was closing. And here is what he did not count on. He did not count on me having anyone like Thomas Breck in my corner. He did not count on me being organized. He did not count on me being exactly as thorough as he was, once I understood what I was looking at. The unexpected alliance arrived without warning. Ruth called that evening, Derek's mother, 61 years old, former preschool teacher. The woman who had folded Claire into her family so completely that Claire had sometimes forgotten the word-in-law, who had also, occasionally, on certain holidays, had a way of looking at Claire that felt slightly like an evaluation. Claire. Ruth's voice on the phone was different, quieter, like she had been rehearsing the call but had decided at the last moment to put the rehearsal away and just say it. "I wanted to call you before Derek told you that I knew." Claire went very still. The apartment was quiet around her. Margaret was in the kitchen. Oscar was pressing on her ribs. "Derek told me 6 weeks ago," Ruth said. "He told me he was going to leave. He told me about the woman. He asked me not to say anything." A silence. "I should have called you immediately," Ruth said. "I did not. I sat with it for 6 weeks telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, and what I was actually doing was choosing my son over you. And I chose wrong. And I need you to know that I know I chose wrong. And I am sorry." Claire did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Why are you calling now?" "Because I am not losing you," Ruth said. Her voice cracked slightly at the end. "And I am not losing that baby. My son made his choices. I am making mine, and I am choosing you." Claire sat with that. She did not forgive Ruth in that moment. She was not a fairy tale. She did not have an immediate flooding warmth. What she had was something more complicated and more honest than that. "I need some time with this, Ruth," she said. Ruth said, "Take all the time you need." And Claire believed her. Mirror moment. She sits in her parked car in the garage of the building, 11 minutes after the meeting with Thomas, before she can make herself drive home. The radio comes on automatically when she starts the engine and she turns it off again. The city is moving past the garage entrance, ordinary and indifferent. She sits in the car with her hands in her lap and she thinks, "I cannot yet be a person who does ordinary things." So she sits. She sits until she can. Then she does. Danny had inserted herself into Claire's life with the energy of someone making amends through action rather than words. She appeared with food. She researched hospitals. She called 3 different labor and delivery units and read the reviews aloud and ranked them. She booked the best reviewed one. She said one evening, while putting away groceries she had not been asked to bring, "I know I cannot undo it, so I'm going to do everything else." Claire let her. Because she was 7.5 months pregnant and she needed all the help that was available to her. And because she was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, that accepting help was not the same as being weak. That was a thing she was still working on. The social exposure arrived one Thursday evening. Derek showed up at the group dinner, the one they had attended together for 4 years. The one where Claire had learned to make the pasta everyone requested. He brought Savannah. Someone from the group called to warn Claire first. Claire did not go. But she knew by 8 o'clock that night that everyone in their social circle now knew everything. Her phone became a steady stream. Some messages were warm. Some were awkward in the way that meant the person was primarily processing their own discomfort. Some were from people she would later understand were never really her friends at all but theirs, and Derek's friends, and when you subtracted Derek, the equation did not balance. She read every message. She answered only a few. She was learning to triage. What required her attention and what did not. The hook, a Thursday afternoon. She is making tea. A long, steady ache begins. She recognizes it from everything she has spent the last month reading. She checks the time. She calls Danny. I need to go to the hospital, she says. Right now? Are you Claire now? Call ahead. I will meet you there. She calls Margaret. She calls Thomas's office and leaves a brief voicemail that says, almost apologetically, I need to reschedule Friday's follow-up. Something has come up. I am going to the hospital. Then she picks up her hospital bag. She packed it 2 weeks ago because she was organized even in chaos, especially in chaos. She goes to the car. She drives herself. She is the strongest woman in this story. She does not know it yet. Oscar was born at 11:53 at night on a Thursday in February, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, 20 inches long, a full head of dark hair and an expression on his face in that first split second when she saw him that Claire would always describe, for the rest of her life, as slightly irritated, as though he had been personally inconvenienced by the process and would like to note it for the record. She fell in love instantly and completely, without warning and without adequate preparation. The way you fall into deep water and every part of you knows it at once. Danny was in the room because Danny had arrived 40 minutes after the call and had not left. Margaret was in the room because Margaret had been there since 2 in the afternoon and also had not left. They stood on either side of her and held her hands and said the things people say in those moments. Beautiful. Look at him. You did it. Oh, Claire. Claire did not hear any of it. She was looking at her son, Oscar. She had chosen the name months ago. Derek had wanted something different, something longer and more formal, and she had considered it and then quietly, gently, maintained her preference in the way she had stopped maintaining preferences about other things. Now she held this specific small person, and she understood with complete certainty that she had been right. He was Oscar. He was fully and entirely Oscar. The name fit him the way his lungs fit the new air. The deep vulnerability did not arrive during labor. It did not arrive in the first rush of hormones and relief, and the particular love that has no comparison point. It arrived much later, around 2 in the morning, when Margaret and Danny had gone to the small family waiting room to rest, when the night nurse had dimmed the overhead lights and brought an extra blanket without being asked, and it was just Claire and Oscar in the quiet room. She was holding him the way the nurse had shown her, slightly elevated, his dark hair visible above the edge of the blanket. He was asleep. He made small sounds that were not quite words and not quite silence. Just existence, just the sounds of a person adjusting to having a body in a bright and loud and complicated world. And she thought, Derek is not here. The thought arrived quietly and then expanded. She thought this was supposed to be different. She thought, I imagined this night so many times. Lying in bed at night when I could not sleep, I would play it out. I would imagine calling him from the hospital and the sound of his voice when I told him it was time. I would imagine his face when he first saw the baby, the look on his face. I had the whole night in my mind, ordered and lit a certain way, and none of it is happening. And the night that is actually happening is not nothing, but it is also not what I built in my head for 7 months, and I cannot get a refund on the grief for the version that did not come. She started to cry quietly, without wanting to. She had not planned to cry tonight. She did not want to wake Oscar. She did not want the night nurse to come back and give her that specific careful look, so she just let it happen quietly. Tears in the dim room, the sound of her own breathing, the sound of the city outside the window, 12 floors down, going about its indifferent night. She cried for a while. Then Oscar made a sound, a small, distinct, firmly indignant sound. The sound of someone who had decided this situation required acknowledgement. And she laughed. She actually laughed, wet and undignified and real, in the quiet hospital room at 2 in the morning, with tears still on her face and her son on her chest. You are right, she whispered to him. Okay, you are absolutely right. That is enough of that. She wiped her face with the edge of the hospital blanket. She held him tighter. She said very quietly, like a promise she was making to someone who mattered more than anyone had ever mattered, I do not have everything figured out. I want you to know that right up front. I do not have a complete plan yet. But I have you, and I think for tonight that might be enough to start with. Mirror moment, the laugh, the unexpected laugh in the middle of the crying. Every woman who has ever been in the worst moment she could imagine and still found the small absurdity inside it, who has been through something devastating and had the experience interrupted by something small and real and slightly funny, knows this laugh. It does not fix anything, but it proves she is still in there, still herself, still the woman who can find the moment inside the moment. Derek came to the hospital the next morning. Ruth had called him. She told Claire this later with the tone of someone who had made her alliances clear but was not pretending that certain facts were not also facts. He is still the father, Ruth said simply. I could not make that call. Claire did not argue. It was not wrong. It was complicated. Those were two different things. Derek arrived with yellow roses. They had been her favorite when they got married. She looked at them and genuinely could not tell whether he remembered that or whether yellow was simply what the hospital gift shop had in stock. She decided it did not matter either way. He stood in the doorway of the room for a moment. He looked at her. He looked at Oscar. He cried. The same genuine way he had cried when she told him about the pregnancy. She watched his face and she believed it. That had always been the most complicated thing about Derek. The emotions were real. They just did not prevent him from doing whatever he was going to do anyway. He is beautiful, Derek said. I know, Claire said. She did not hand him the baby. She waited to see if he would ask. He looked at Oscar from across the room, from a distance that he seemed to understand he had chosen for himself. He did not ask. I want to be involved, he said, as his father. Whatever happens between us, I want to be part of his life. That is going to be a conversation, Claire said. For a time when I am not 24 hours postpartum, and you are not holding yellow roses in a room you do not have any standing to be in. He nodded. He set the roses on the windowsill. He sat in the chair across the room for 40 minutes, mostly looking at Oscar. He asked twice if she needed anything, and she said no both times. Then he left. She looked at Oscar. She thought, okay, so that is the shape of it. He is going to show up. He is going to be present in the way that he defines presence. I can work with that. I can make something workable out of that. It is not what I wanted. But not everything is what you wanted, and the things that are not what you wanted still require you to figure out what you are going to do with them. Breathing room. The second night in the hospital. Alone with Oscar again. The nurses have shown her everything. The feeding, the swaddling, the particular way of holding him that settles his nervous system. She is better at this than she expected. Not because it comes naturally, though parts of it do, but because she is paying complete attention, and she has always been good at whatever she gives her complete attention to. This is the thing that Derek took for granted and that she is, very slowly, beginning to take back. Oscar is asleep. The room is dim. She opens her phone. She does not open any messages. She does not check social media. She opens her old design portfolio and she looks at it again, in the blue light of the hospital room in the middle of the night. The logos she built, the campaigns she ran, the clients who called her brilliant, who depended on her instinct, who came back repeatedly because she understood things about what a brand needed that not everyone understood. She looks at it for a long time, then she closes the app. She thinks, I was not nobody before I was his wife, and I will not be nobody after. Hook she hears through Ruth, who has become against all logic her most reliable source of information about the outer world, that Derek has moved into a 2-bedroom apartment with Savannah. Same general zip code. Ruth reports this neutrally, with the tone of someone who has decided where her loyalties are and is not pretending otherwise. Claire files this away. She also files away the observation that Derek apparently believes proximity is equivalent to presence. She is beginning to understand with increasing clarity that they are entirely different things. Oscar was 4 months old when Claire went back to work. Not for anyone else, for herself. She had started thinking about it in the hospital. She had let herself think about it seriously in the weeks that followed. Between feedings and the physical recovery that took longer than she had expected, and the paperwork. There was so much paperwork. Divorce has paperwork the way grief has weight, constant and present and heavier than anticipated. She had not made the decision quickly. She sat with it. She talked it through with the people she was learning to talk things through with honestly. Margaret said, you have been tabbing somebody's support act for 6 years. It is time to be the headline. Danny said, I will be your first client. I will pay full rate, and I will tell every single person I know. Thomas noted, in his methodical way, that documented self-employment income would be relevant to the financial proceedings, which was practical, but also, in its way, encouraging. She started with a name, Ashworth Creative. She sat with it for 7 days. She turned it over. She examined it from different angles. She asked herself honestly whether she was keeping his name out of habit or out of strategy. The answer, when she was honest, was strategy. The name carried recognition in certain professional circles where she had worked before. She was not going to discard a usable asset because of sentiment. That was not the kind of thinking she was doing anymore. Then she opened the laptop at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Oscar and his bouncer beside her, the bouncer they had found at a second-hand store, because she was being careful about money now in a way she had not needed to be before, and she built a logo. 3 hours. One cup of coffee that went cold, a few false starts. And then at some point in the third hour, something clicked. The way things click when you are doing work that is actually yours. And she looked at what she had made on the screen. It was clean, simple. Her initials arranged in a way that was both professional and distinctive. A mark you could put on anything, and it would make that thing look more considered. She looked at it for a long time. She thought, there I am. Mirror moment. Danny comes over on Sunday morning and finds Claire at the kitchen table with Oscar and his bouncer beside her. 3 browser tabs of design work open, coffee gone cold. Danny stands in the doorway looking at this picture. Her friend with the circles under her eyes and the focused expression. The baby making small self-important sounds. The work on the screen that is clearly good work, visible even from across the room. This is joy, Danny thinks. This is what it looks like in real life. It does not look dramatic. It looks like cold coffee and 3 tabs and a person completely alive in what she is doing. You are doing it, Danny said. Claire looked up with the expression of someone who had genuinely forgotten Danny was coming. I am doing it, she agreed. The divorce proceedings had been intensifying for weeks. Thomas was building a case that was not simply about ending a marriage. It was about documented financial concealment. With a financial analyst he had worked with for years, he had established that Derek had moved approximately $94,000 across joint accounts over the 8 months of the affair. Every transfer had dates. Every transfer had records. The paper trail was complete and thorough and damning. Claire sat in Thomas's office and looked at the spreadsheet. That is not just cheating, she said. No, Thomas agreed, that is theft. It is a legally significant financial misappropriation that, combined with the insurance removal during your pregnancy, gives us considerable leverage in these proceedings. She looked at the spreadsheet for another moment, then she looked up. I want fair, she said. Not scorched earth, not vindictive. Fair. But I want all affair. Every dollar, every consideration, all affair. Thomas allowed himself a small, controlled smile. That, he said, is exactly what I do. Ruth had become a fixture in Claire's daily life in a way that neither of them had anticipated or planned. She came twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, unless one of them had a conflict which they arranged around. She held Oscar while Claire worked. She did not talk about Derek unless Claire asked, which was almost never. She brought specific things each time because she had noticed Oscar's preferences the way grandmothers notice things, with precise and total attention. What they developed between them was not friendship, exactly. It was something more specific. An agreement between 2 women who loved the same person, the small person with the dark hair and the permanently skeptical expression, and had decided independently that love required showing up. One Tuesday, without any preamble, Ruth said, I raised Derek to be better than he was. Claire did not respond immediately. I think he is capable of being better, she said finally. I just was not the person who could get that out of him. I do not know if that is about me or about him. It does not really matter at this point. Ruth was quiet. Maybe no one can get it out of him, she said. Maybe that is work he has to do himself. Maybe, Claire said. Oscar was asleep in Ruth's arms. He had the milk-drunk expression of a creature who had thoroughly solved all current problems. Both women looked at him. Whatever else, Ruth said, he made something real. He did, Claire agreed. Claire started therapy that month. A therapist named Carolyn, who worked specifically with women navigating major life transitions. The sessions were not dramatic. They were not what therapy looks like in stories. They were the careful, sometimes tedious, sometimes surprisingly painful work of examining your own patterns with someone who was trained to help you see what you had stopped being able to see yourself. One session, Carolyn said, tell me about the first time you made yourself smaller for Derek. Claire thought about it, really thought. He got a promotion, she said, first year of our marriage. His boss took him to a dinner I was not invited to. He came home excited, genuinely excited, and I thought, this is his thing. I should make room for his thing. And I did. And at that moment, that was the right call. But then there was always another thing. And I kept making room. And eventually, the room I was making was the room where I used to be. Carolyn wrote something. What would you like the room to look like now? She asked. Claire thought about the logo on the screen, about Oscar and the bouncer, about cold coffee and the feeling of her own competence running through her like a current she had almost forgotten was there. Full, she said. I want the room to be full. Validation whisper, I chose wrong for myself, in ways I let happen and in ways that were encouraged. I am done analyzing exactly where the line is between those two things. What I know now is that I am not small. I was never small, I was in a small space. And I have left the small space, and I am learning what my actual size is. And it turns out is considerably larger than I had been allowing. Hook, 7 months after Oscar's birth, an email arrives in the Ashworth Creative Inquiry form. The subject line says, I do not expect you to respond to this. The name in the sender field is Savannah Price. Claire reads the email 3 times. She sets her phone down. She picks up Oscar, who is in the middle of a serious project involving a toy that makes 5 different sounds, and she holds him for a moment and breathes. Then she goes back and reads the email a fourth time. She thinks about it for 2 days. Then she writes back. They met at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground was Claire's suggestion, and she had chosen the specific place, close enough to her office that she knew the exits and the layout, far enough from her neighborhood that the likelihood of running into anyone she knew was low. She arrived 8 minutes early. She ordered tea, because today she wanted her hands to be warm and steady rather than caffeinated and uncertain. She chose a table near the window with a clear sightline to the door. She watched the street while she waited, and she tried methodically to locate what she was actually feeling. Not what she was supposed to feel, what she actually felt. Savannah came in at exactly the hour. She was younger looking than Claire had expected, which was irrational since she had known from the text messages that Savannah was 31, but knowing something as a number and meeting it as a person were different experiences. She was smaller than Claire had pictured, compact, not fragile. She had the careful put-together look of someone who had prepared for this meeting and had also been crying recently, and had done a very thorough job of managing both of those things. She sat down across from Claire. She said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I was not sure you would." Claire looked at her. She had expected to find more hatred than she found. She had expected it to arrive easily, the way anger had been arriving easily for months. What she found instead was something more complicated, something that required more careful handling. "Say what you came to say," Claire said. Savannah took a breath. "He told me you were separated," she said. He told me the marriage had been effectively over for more than a year, that you were both living there out of practicality and waiting for the right time to make it formal." Claire said nothing. "He told me the pregnancy was unplanned," Savannah continued, "and that you had both agreed to continue with it, even though the marriage was already over. That it was complicated, but that you had both decided whatever happened with the two of you, you both wanted the baby and you would figure out what co-parenting looked like. He told me you knew about us, that you knew and had accepted it as part of an arrangement you had arrived at together." She stopped. "He said none of it was a secret," she said quietly. "He said you knew." Claire let the silence hold for a moment. "I found out about you," she said carefully, "from a notification on his phone at 11:47 at night when he thought I was asleep." Savannah closed her eyes. "I know that now," she said. "I know that now, and I feel—" She stopped. "I do not have adequate words for what I feel about it. I know you do not owe me anything. Not your time, not this conversation, not your forgiveness, not your understanding. I know that. But I needed you to know in person that I would not have. If I had known the actual situation, I would not have." "I believe you," Claire said. Savannah looked up, like she had not expected that. "I believe you," Claire said again, "because I know him. I was married to him for 6 years. I know exactly how he sounds when he is making something make sense. He is very good at constructing a version of events that feels coherent and that puts him where he needs to be in the story. He has been doing it his entire adult life. You were not the first person he convinced of something convenient. I just happened to be the one who was married to him while it happened." Savannah's hands were around her coffee cup. "He and I are over," she said. "We have been over since I found out the truth about 4 months ago." She paused, choosing. "He is not handling it well." Claire absorbed this. "He is alone?" she said. "Yes." This information arrived and she waited to feel victory, and the victory did not come in the form she expected. What came was more like a picture completing itself. More information, more of the shape of things. "I came to say I am sorry," Savannah said. "I know it does not undo anything. I know sorry is the least useful thing I have. But I am sorry, genuinely, for the part I played in it. Even an unknowing part is still a part." Claire looked at this woman across the table. She thought about all the different ways two people could be wronged by the same person, differently, not equally, but in ways that sometimes overlapped. "I accept your apology," she said. Savannah nodded. Her eyes were very bright. "Is there anything—" She stopped. Tried again. "I know this is a strange question. I know how this whole meeting is. But is there anything I can do? I have some reach professionally. I work in design-adjacent content. I have a following. If there is anything that would actually be useful—" Claire looked at her for a long moment. "Are you on Instagram?" she said. Savannah blinked. "Yes. Around 12,000 followers. Style content mostly." Something shifted in Claire's mind. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something more practical than that. Something she was good at, which was looking at what was available and figuring out what could be built from it. "I might reach out to you," she said, "in a few months, about a potential professional collaboration." Savannah stared at her. "That is, do not read too much into it," Claire said. "I am a businesswoman. You have an audience. I have a product. If the numbers make sense, the numbers make sense." The meeting ended a few minutes later. They stood on the sidewalk outside. There was a moment of awkward potential in the air between them. Savannah extended her hand. Claire shook it. They did not hug. They were not there. Maybe they would never be there. But they were also not enemies. They were two women on a sidewalk with more complexity between them than either had chosen or bargained for, and each of them was choosing, in her own way, not to let that complexity define the rest of anything. Mirror moment. On the drive home, she sits in the parked car outside her building for 9 minutes before she can make herself go in. Ruth is inside with Oscar. He is fine. She knows he is fine. But she sits in the car with her hands in her lap and she looks at the street and she takes inventory of herself. She thinks, I am a different person than the woman who sat on the edge of the bed with his phone in her hands. Not harder, larger. There is a difference. She is still finding out exactly how large. Then she gets out of the car. She goes inside to her son. Breathing room. That night, after Oscar is asleep and the apartment is quiet, she sits on the floor of the nursery with her back against the yellow wall. Not in the rocking chair, on the floor, knees up. She does not look at her phone. She does not make plans. She sits in the dim room and she listens to Oscar breathe, that small, steady sound, and she breathes with him. In and out, in and out. After a while, something in her chest loosens. Not all the way, just a few degrees, just enough to be worth noticing. She gets up, she goes to bed. She sleeps. Ashworth Creative launched publicly on a Tuesday in March, and it was not a dramatic moment in the way that dramatic moments look. There was a website that had taken 3 weeks to build correctly, and one very late night to make perfect. There was a social media post with the logo, and 3 lines about who she was and what she did. And there was Danny, who shared it to her considerable professional network with a caption that said, "My brilliant best friend is open for business. Hire her before she gets too famous to take your call." Danny also sent a screenshot text 11 minutes later that said, "Already 3 inquiries." Claire was feeding Oscar when the notification came. She read Danny's text. She sat with it for a moment. She felt something warm and strange move through her. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and more private than triumph. The specific satisfaction of a thing that was predicted against and did not care. She called her mother. "The website went live," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I have been refreshing it since 7 this morning." "Mama, 47 times, baby. I refreshed it 47 times. It is a beautiful website. I showed it to my entire book club. Diane wants a logo for her catering business. I gave her your phone number." "Did you tell her to fill out the inquiry form?" "I did not know about the inquiry form. It is fine." Claire was laughing. She was actually genuinely laughing. "It is completely fine, Mama." The divorce finalized on a Tuesday morning in Thomas's office. Not dramatically. No one was present who did not need to be. Just Thomas and Claire and the clean winter light coming through the windows and a pen and a set of papers that had taken 5 months to arrive at. Thomas had done, as promised, all of fair. Every dollar of the financial concealment was documented and addressed. Every relevant factor was weighed. The property settlement was complete. The custody arrangement was clear and workable. Claire primary, Derek regular scheduled access. A structure that protected Oscar's relationship with both of his parents while making the decision-making authority absolutely clear. She signed the papers. She sat for a moment after. Thomas set his pen down. He looked at her. "How are you?" he asked. She looked at the document. "I got married at 28, she said. "I thought I was building something permanent. I thought I was making the most significant choice of my life." "You were," he said. "The choice turned out to be wrong." "That is different," he said, carefully, from having made the wrong choice. "You had a set of information. You had a person presenting himself in a particular way. You chose in good faith with what you had." She looked at him. "You are oddly therapeutic for a divorce attorney." "It comes from doing this work long enough," he said. "Is there anything you need before you go?" She looked at the papers one more time. "No," she said. "I think I have everything I need." She walked out of the building into the March air. It was cold and sharp and clean. She stood on the sidewalk. She breathed it in. She called Danny. "It is done," she said. "Meet me for lunch," Danny said. "Yes," Claire said. "Somewhere expensive. He is paying." Mirror moment, standing on the sidewalk outside Thomas's office in the March cold. Not crying. Not celebrating. Just breathing. She thinks, "I spent 6 years building something that turned out to be built on something other than what I believed it was built on. And I spent 1 year building something on concrete, on my own capability, on my own work, on the evidence of what I can actually do when given access to the full space. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything." Oscar at 9 months was sitting up on his own and regarding the world with his characteristic skepticism. He had strong opinions about everything and communicated them with surprising efficiency for a person with a very limited vocabulary. Claire's client list grew. A local restaurant doing a full rebrand. A small nonprofit that needed a campaign for their annual fundraiser and had been operating with a logo that had been designed in 1992. Danny's real estate office, which became a steady account with quarterly work. She worked from home mostly. Oscar was nearby. Her life was louder than it used to be, and more interrupted than it used to be, and also more real than it had been in years. The collaboration with Savannah happened in October. 3 months after the coffee shop, Claire reached out professionally, directly, with a clear proposal. Savannah would share 3 pieces of content featuring Claire's design work. She would credit Ashworth Creative by name and include a trackable link. In exchange, Claire would design 3 brand assets for Savannah's growing personal brand at no charge. Savannah responded in 48 hours. Yes. Obviously yes. The content performed well. 3 pieces, 12,000 followers, and the particular algorithmic alchemy of the right niche finding the right audience at the right moment. 41 new inquiries by the end of the month. She hired a part-time contractor for intake. This was not a story about forgiveness turning into friendship. This was a story about 2 women who were wronged by the same person in different ways, and who looked at what remained after the damage and made a practical, clear-eyed choice to use what they had to build what they needed. That, too, was its own kind of justice. Breathing room, one Saturday morning. Oscar is napping. The work is done for now. The apartment is quiet in the particular way. Apartments are quiet when a baby is sleeping, which is both peaceful and slightly anticipatory. Claire makes coffee, real coffee, the kind she had been making since she moved into this apartment, the kind she had gradually stopped making in the last years of the marriage, because Derek preferred a different kind and it was easier to just have one kind. She sits by the window with it. She does not open her laptop. She does not check her phone. She just sits in the morning light with warm coffee in both hands and she watches the street below. The sun comes through the window. The coffee is exactly the right temperature. Oscar will be awake in about 40 minutes with his list of opinions. She has a presentation Monday that she knows is going to go well. She takes a long, slow drink of coffee and she thinks, this is what I was trying to protect when I called it a good life before. But this is the actual thing. Hook, an email arrives from a design publication with significant professional readership. They have come across her portfolio online. They would like to feature Ashworth Creative in their businesses to watch series. She reads it twice. She replies, I would be delighted. Transformed power does not always arrive as a moment of recognition. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of a feeling you expected to have. It came on an ordinary Sunday. Oscar was 14 months old. He was walking, more or less. More accurately, he was performing a kind of determined, controlled falling that technically covered ground and that he treated with the seriousness appropriate to a major physical achievement. He had been at this for 3 weeks. He took it very seriously. He expected recognition. They were in the small courtyard of the building where Claire now lived. She had moved 3 months after the divorce finalized. A larger apartment in a neighborhood she had always wanted to try. In the abstract way, you want things that do not seem quite available to you. Closer to Margaret, who had made the move from Georgia, permanent with the stated reasoning that her reasons were Oscar, and she would not be elaborating further. Closer to Danny, who lived 6 blocks away and appeared at unpredictable intervals with food and opinions. A building with a courtyard that had a bench and a gate with a pattern in the iron and a small tree that was already turning green in the March thaw. It was Sunday morning. Oscar was making his way across the courtyard with the focused determination of someone completing an important task. Claire was on the bench with her coffee and her phone, watching him and half reading an email from a client who had questions about a color palette. She heard tires on the street outside the gate. She looked up without thinking much about it. Car had slowed, then stopped. She saw Derek before he saw her. He was in a different car than the one she remembered, a lease. Ruth had mentioned once in passing. He was looking down at his phone. Then he looked up, through the windshield. Through the wrought iron gate of the courtyard, he saw Claire on the bench. He saw Oscar. She watched his eyes take in what was in front of him. The courtyard of a building that was nicer than the apartment they had shared. The bench and the way she was sitting on it. The posture of someone who was comfortable in her space and her body in a way she had not been in years. The coffee in her hand. The phone on the bench beside her with the Ashworth Creative logo visible as the screensaver. The life that was clearly operating. And Oscar. Oscar, who spotted the stopped car, because Oscar spotted everything and considered this his primary professional responsibility, and who paused in the middle of his crossing to examine the car with his customary appraising expression, one hand on the nearby bench railing for balance, dark hair slightly disheveled from the morning. The expression of a person forming an opinion. Derek lifted his hand, something between a wave and an acknowledgement. Claire nodded. He drove away, and she looked at Oscar, who had already lost interest in the car and resumed his project. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. She waited for what she would feel. What she felt was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was not the vindication she had imagined on hard nights in the early months. It was simpler than that, more complete than that. Settled. She felt settled. Like a question she had been carrying had quietly, without announcement, been answered. Not by Derek seeing her, not by anything external to her, by the morning in the courtyard and the coffee and her son's determined walking, and the work on her phone and the life that was simply, evidently hers. He had all of me, she thought. He had my time and my trust and my loyalty and my future. He had everything I gave him access to, and he chose to throw it away for a lie he told a woman who did not even know she was helping him tell it. And I got everything back, not from him. I did not get it back because he returned it. I got it back because it was always mine. It was mine the whole time. He just had the part I gave him access to. The rest was here waiting. The business and the sun and the morning and this courtyard and this bench. It was here the whole time. I just had to come back for it. Mirror moment. She does not call Danny about this. She does not text her mother. She does not process it out loud with anyone. She sits with it in the quiet courtyard, and she processes it herself, in the time it takes Oscar to get to the other end and turn around and look at her with his achievement expression. That is the measure of distance traveled. A year ago, any Derek-adjacent event required recovery time, required another person's voice telling her she was all right. Today, she processes it alone in the time it takes a 14-month-old to cross a courtyard, and then she finishes her coffee, and that is that. That evening, she video called Margaret. Margaret asked how she was doing, in the way that meant she wanted the real answer. Claire thought about it. I saw Derek today, she said, outside the building. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You okay, she asked. Yes, Claire said. I think, Mama, I spent a lot of time being afraid of what it would feel like. I thought it would undo something. I thought I would have to go through all of it again. But it was just a moment. It came and it went. And Oscar walked all the way across the courtyard by himself today. Margaret laughed, the real laugh, the one that started in her chest. He has been practicing on me all week, she said. He gets so serious about it. I know, Claire said. He has opinions about distances. They talked about Oscar, about the business, about the new client who had found her through the publication feature and who had an interesting project. About Margaret's book club, in which apparently significant drama had developed around a disputed interpretation of a novel that had been selected specifically because everyone thought it would be uncontroversial. Before they hung up, Margaret said, Can I say something to you? Of course, Claire said. I have watched you this year, her mother said. I have watched you the whole time, and I have watched you do something that most people are not able to do. You went through something that could have made you smaller, the kind of thing that makes people smaller. And you came out larger, not harder, larger. And those are very different things. Claire did not say anything for a moment. He did not take anything from me, she said finally, that I could not rebuild. He just made me find out what I was actually made of. Her mother smiled. Claire could hear it in the quality of the silence. Queen, her mother said, and Claire laughed. Validation whispered, this is not a story about surviving. Surviving is the floor. This is a story about a woman who looked at what remained after the demolition and recognized that it was not rubble. It was foundation, that the demolition had removed what was built on it, but the foundation had always been there, had always been hers. And on it she built something that belonged to her entirely, and when that thing was complete enough to be visible, and when the person who had forced the demolition drove past it, what she felt was not anger and not vindication and not the complicated satisfaction of watching someone else fail. What she felt was settled. And settled, it turns out, is the best feeling available. Ashworth Creative turned 1-year-old on a Thursday. From the outside, it was not a notable event. There was no party, no ceremony. Danny came over in the evening with sparkling wine for herself and sparkling water for Claire, who had simply stopped drinking somewhere in the chaos of the past year and found she did not miss it, and they sat at the kitchen table while Oscar performed his cabinet routine, which involved removing items from the lower cabinets and replacing them in a different order, which he found endlessly satisfying and which Claire had learned not to discourage because it kept him occupied for up to 20 minutes. But inside the numbers, it was a significant moment. Real revenue. Actual, sustainable, growing revenue from clients who hired her not out of familiarity or pity, but because her work was good and her instinct for what a brand needed was sharp, and her process was professional and dependable. 13 clients. A part-time contractor who handled intake and administrative work. A rate that had increased twice in 12 months because the market had confirmed, through repeated willingness to pay it, that she was charging less than she was worth. Danny held the printed financial summary. She read it twice. Claire, she said. I know, Claire said. This is real money. I know. In 1 year. Danny, Danny put the paper down the table. She looked at her friend, at the woman she had known for 20 years, who was sitting across from her in an apartment she had signed for, alone with a business she had built from approximately nothing in the middle of the worst year of her life. I am very proud of you, and I am sorry for the ways I let you down. Both of those things are completely true. Claire looked at her. Both of those things are completely true, she agreed. Mirror moment, the printed financial summary on the kitchen table. 1 year ago, she was sitting at a kitchen table at midnight with her husband's phone in her hands, learning that the life she had believed she was living had a shadow version she had not been permitted to see. Today, she is sitting at her own kitchen table with a document that is the proof of what she built from the evening that shadow was revealed. The table is different. The kitchen is different. She is very different. The coffee is still getting cold. Some things do not change. Oscar at 14 months, at 17 months, at 20. A child who makes his grandmother Margaret laugh more than she has laughed in years. Who makes Ruth Ashworth arrive every Tuesday with specific snacks purchased from specific places and specific books chosen with specific intention, with the expression of someone who has identified the most important project of her later life and is executing it with appropriate seriousness. A child who holds his breath when something surprises him and then exhales loudly, as though releasing a judgment. A child who has already developed very clear preferences about music and who communicates these preferences at volume. A child who reaches his arms up to his mother when she walks into a room, which is the only greeting in the world that has ever actually mattered. Derek had, by all reliable accounts, stabilized. He was a better father than he had been a husband. This was a common pattern, and Claire had decided it was not her work to analyze. He showed up on schedule. He was present. He had started, apparently, examining the things about himself that needed examining. Ruth reported this with the cautious optimism of a woman who had made her bet and was watching it evolve. Claire received the information. She filed it. She did not wish him badly. She did not wish him well in the way that required her ongoing attention or investment. She wished him the amount of well-being that was directly relevant to Oscar's experience of having a father. That was the precise and total extent of her concern. This was what freedom actually felt like. Not the freedom that arrived in a dramatic moment of declaration. The freedom that arrived quietly, over time, when you realized you had stopped tracking someone. When you realized that your mental landscape had so thoroughly filled itself with your own life, that there was no longer space for the maintenance of someone else's story. She was free. On a Tuesday morning in April, Claire was at her desk before Oscar woke up. The apartment was quiet. The city outside the window was gray with early light and beginning its day. She was looking at a new project, a branding package for a women-owned bakery that had been operating in the same location for 11 years and had decided it was time for a visual identity that matched what they had actually become. She made some notes. She sketched directions in a small notebook. She made her coffee. The real kind. She thought about that night 18 months ago. The phone on the nightstand, the screen lighting up, the shower running, the walk to the kitchen, her own face in the dark glass of the window. She thought about what she had thought, standing at the counter with her hand on her stomach. I knew. I knew, and I let myself not know. She thought about all the versions of herself between that night and this Tuesday morning. The woman in the lawyer's office looking at a spreadsheet of everything that had been taken from her. The woman who drove herself to the hospital with a packed bag. The woman who cried in the dark with a newborn and then laughed because the newborn made a sound. The woman who looked at her old portfolio on a hospital room phone screen at 3 in the morning and thought, I was not nobody before. She thought about all the ground between those moments in this kitchen. Then she thinks, he did not take anything from me that I could not rebuild. She opens her laptop. She begins to work. Late morning. Oscar announces his presence by appearing in the kitchen doorway with both arms up and an expression that suggests the morning has been proceeding without adequate acknowledgement of him. She looks at him. She thinks about the kitchen she chose, in the apartment she signed for alone, in the life she built from approximately nothing, with her own hands and her own work, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from having everything stripped down to the essential question of who you actually are. He is in his high chair with his cereal and his professional expression. Her phone lights up on the counter, a notification from the Ashworth Creative Inquiry form. She picks it up. She is not afraid of what the screen will show her. She never will be again. She reads the inquiry. Good potential client. She can tell from the brief description and the care they have taken in filling out the form. The kind of client who has thought about what they need before they ask for it. She responds. She schedules the call. She sets the phone back on the counter. She looks at Oscar, who has dispatched his cereal and is now looking at her with the expression that means the next phase of the morning is being requested. What? She says. He reaches his arms up. She lifts him out of the high chair. He settles against her hip with the ease of a creature who has never had to wonder where home is, who arrived in the world knowing, who has never had any doubt about this particular question. She carries him to the window. They look out at the street below, the ordinary Tuesday morning, the city going about its business. Delivery trucks and dog walkers and a woman in a yellow coat who is talking on her phone and gesturing at something only she can see. This is what living as a queen actually looks like. Not a crown, not a dramatic reckoning, not Derek reduced and humiliated, though the universe arranged some of that without her involvement or attention. Just this, a window, a child on her hip who thinks she hung the moon, work that is hers waiting on the counter, a morning that belongs entirely to her. Wisdom moment, it is not a speech. It is not a declaration. It is just a thought that arrives quietly while she stands at the window with her son, the kind of thought that settles in and stays. He had all of me, she thinks. He had my time and my work and my trust and my future. He had everything I gave him access to, and I got it back. Not from him, not because he returned it. I got it back because it was mine the whole time. Because the part of me he thought he had was the part I was showing him. The rest of it, the actual me, the capable and resourceful and thorough and creative and determined me, that was here the whole time, waiting. I just had to clear the space for her. She looks at Oscar. He is watching a bird on the outside of the windowsill with the focused intensity of a person encountering something that requires his full professional assessment. She thinks, I do not know what comes next. I do not know what my life looks like in 5 years or 10. I do not know who else is going to be in it. I do not know what Oscar becomes, though I have theories. I do not know what I become past this April morning. That used to feel frightening. Not knowing. The not knowing used to feel like standing at the edge of something with nothing below. Now it just feels like what living is. She holds him a little tighter. The bird decides the windowsill is not what it was looking for and flies away. Oscar watches it go with dignified acceptance. Outside, the city moves through its Tuesday. Inside this apartment, in this morning, at this window, the woman who typed divorce wrong twice at midnight 18 months ago is standing with her son on her hip and her phone on the counter and her work on the desk and her life entirely, demonstrably, irrevocably her own. She was always exactly enough. She just had to find out for herself. And now she knows.